Sudan's military junta shoot and kill protesters calling for democracy. Does this end hopes of a transition to civilian rule? And why hasn't the international community stepped in? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Halla Mohieddeen. After months of peaceful demonstrations for civilian rule, Sudan's military junta has had enough. Security forces carried out a dawn raid to break up a sit-in outside the army's headquarters in the capital, Khartoum. Many were killed, others critically wounded by bullets and tear gas. Soldiers then stormed a hospital and shot at the injured. The main opposition group has stopped all contact with the Transitional Military Council that has been in power since April. It's calling for civil disobedience until the military regime is overthrown. Well, Al Jazeera has been banned from reporting from Sudan, but we've heard first-hand accounts from protesters. Here's their testimony of the military crackdown as it happened.
It's a massacre. Massacre has happened, okay? And I am from here. I am demanding, I am requesting, I'm telling the international community and the UN to help Sudan. These are like non-violent civilians, and the militia of Mohieddeen is all over the place, and he's taking over without no right.
Mamadou, you're running, aren't you? Why are you running? What are you running away from?
Yeah, they're coming from different sides. They're coming from different side streets, from the right and the left side streets, so we're trying to find cover.
Mamadou, who is approaching? Who are you actually running away from?
That's what I said. We're being attacked by the rapid police forces and the police. But there is something that I witnessed which was really interesting when the rapid police forces, when the police forces came to disperse the protest from the Nile Street, from the eastern side, northern side of the protest area. Some soldiers of the rapid police forces were trying to stop the police. They were pushing the police back.
For the military to fire live round bullets on the protesters and on our nation, and you stand and watch, this is the scene I can't even describe. Our people came to the square for a sit-in because this is our country. It's cowardly for you to watch this happening and do nothing. We're calling on the security forces to move, without instruction from their seniors. Do something about this to protect this nation.
What I can see from my place, like hundreds of forces on dozens of vehicles. They came from all directions. They started with raiding the barricades around the square using military vehicles and big trucks. And now they entered. Actually, now they are parts of them have reached actually the middle of the sit-in square, using live bullets, using tear gas.
Well, the crackdown has been condemned internationally. The British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt called it an outrageous step that will only lead to more polarisation and violence. And the US Embassy in Khartoum says the attack on protesters and civilians is wrong and must be stopped. And the responsibility for that lies with the Military Council. Well, Egypt supports the military junta and has called on all parties to exercise restraint, saying Egypt is following the recent events in Sudan and their repercussions with great concern. Egypt also underscores the importance that all Sudanese sides commit to calm, self-restraint and return to the negotiating table. Well, let's bring in our panel from Washington, D.C. David Shinn, a former Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Sudan. From Keele in the UK, we're joined by Awol Allo, a senior lecturer at Keele University. And also joining us from Washington, D.C., Aly Verjee, a visiting researcher at the United States Institute of Peace. Gentlemen, thank you all for taking part in this discussion. My first question goes to you, Aly Verjee, in Washington, D.C. My first question is, Was this inevitable in some way, that we would see a crackdown from the military after weeks of stalemate and no progress being made on a transition of power?
The warning signs have been there. The Military Council has itself warned that it wasn't going to tolerate further disruption. And in the last few days before today, there have been several killings on the streets of Khartoum. So what's happened today in Khartoum and also in other cities beyond the capital wasn't entirely surprising. It is unfortunate. It does suggest that the Military Council has been stalling for time. The negotiations haven't really been going anywhere and now has moved quite violently against the protesters in a completely unacceptable way, and perhaps with premeditation. You don't get this kind of crackdown at the end of Ramadan as Eid is approaching just by accident. So it really demonstrates that the Transitional Military Council isn't necessarily committed to a peaceful transition despite what they've said and promised to put in place in Sudan.
I'll pick you up on those points in just a second, Ali. But Awol, to you in the UK, would you agree with that? That there was a certain inevitability to the way that this has broken down?
Absolutely. I think there have been very clear signals, indications over the course of the last several weeks that there will be an escalation, in the sense that the military have some entrenched interests that it wants to protect. In order for it to protect those interests, including protecting itself from accountability for past abuses, it is important for them to maintain an important part of the transitional authority to the transitional government. So this sticking issue between the alliance of opposition groups in the Military Council, which is the composition of the sovereign authority, is precisely, I think, that power that they needed in order to preserve their own interest. There are also broader, I think, regional issues that has in some ways led to the current escalation. But certainly I agree with the guest that this was inevitable and the signs were all around.
OK, we'll go on to the regional issues in a moment. But David Shinn joining us from Washington, D.C. We've heard two guests now who've said that this was inevitable, that the warning signs were there for some time. Why do you think the military have done this? Why do you think the military have moved, not just in Khartoum, but in cities across Sudan, to quash these protests?
I think it's a question of frustration building up on both sides. The military feels that it's not getting control of the situation, desperately reaching out to try to get control, doing it in a way which is, I'm afraid, going to be a serious setback towards any kind of peaceful resolution of the conflict. But both sides seem to be digging in. I don't see that this kind of a response by the military is going to advance at all the prospects for resolving this in some kind of a reasonable way. Both sides are going to have to step back if this is going to work.
Is there anything significant in the timing of this crackdown? Aly Verjee, you were talking about how this is coming at the end of Ramadan. We talked about how this is a dawn raid. There seemed to be an element of coordination, given that it was not just in Khartoum, but several cities and areas across Sudan. But in terms of the timing, is there anything significant about the time that this took place?
Well, let me just be clear first. I don't think this is inevitable. I think this is a deliberate choice by the Military Council to act against the protesters, and the warning signs were there, but it could have been averted. In terms of the timing, certainly I think, as David Shinn has just said, there's been some growing frustration on the part of the Military Council. But I also think the Military Council understands that if it acts against the protesters and disperses the protesters in Khartoum, then in some warped logic, it feels this strengthens its position, particularly if there isn't a broader response from the African Union and from the international community more broadly. So in terms of timing, there is a question as to, would it have mattered if it happened a week from now or a week before now? I'm not sure that is necessarily as significant, But there is clearly a deadline for the Transitional Military Council of June 30th, by which the African Union has said this is the end date you have. And so that timeline is in mind. But I think they're more driven by their internal dynamics and their internal desire to present themselves as a legitimate authority. Of course, paradoxically, these actions only delegitimize them further.
You said you think this was a very deliberate choice by the military. Why do you think then that they've taken this choice and they've taken it now after saying that they were prepared to negotiate with protesters?
Well, we hear two things, because even today, one of the spokesmen of the military council has said, oh, we weren't targeting the sit-in site, we were targeting an adjacent site and unruly protesters. So you see there is some reluctance to be fully accepting of what they've done. I think the question of timing today or in the last few days, because it's clearly been building, suggests that they're out of patience, and there is an internal dynamic to the Transitional Military Council and the different members of it that we're really unable to fully divine. But it is there, and there is tension, and there is a reality that this is an internal reconfiguration of the security actors within Sudan as well. But overall, I think there's a general sense that they can get away with it, and that in some ways this is very much pulling from the playbook of Bashir and what happened prior to April with this talk of repressing the protesters and making it all go away. So ultimately, it was a calculation that there won't be consequences, or there won't be serious consequences for the military council.
Awol Allo, would you agree with that, or do you think there is another element to the significance of the timing of this particular crackdown? Are they following the playbook of Bashir, or are they emboldened in some other way?
I think there is an external dimension to this. You remember recently both the head and the deputy head of the Transitional Military Council, General Burhan and General Hamdan, visited Saudi Arabia. It is really in few days' time after returning from Saudi Arabia, they escalated their rhetorics, basically referring to protesters as a threat to the stability and security of Sudan. So this turn in kind of securitizing the protest movement followed shortly after that meeting. And I think, the fact that the Saudis and Emiratis have expressed support for the Transitional Military Council, they are supporting them financially. And the fact that this escalation coincided with the return of the visit of these two very important individuals. Remember the deputy head of the military council is the man who is in charge of the rapid support forces, who are suspected of perpetrating these abuses today. So the fact that I think this happened shortly after they returned from Saudi suggests that there is certainly an encouragement of some sort on the part of the Saudis. I also want to comment on the point that Ali raised in terms of the warning by the African Union. I don't think Sudan or the Military Council are particularly worried about the threat from the African Union to suspend Sudan from the membership of the Union. This is the third warning. The deadline is end of June. But even if Sudan was to be suspended, and I think the likelihood of that happening with Egypt as president of the Union is very small, but even if that was to happen, Sudan knows that that is not really going to affect it in any significant way. Egypt was suspended in July of 2013 when the military removed the democratically elected president there, and nothing really happened to Egypt. Egypt was accepted back, and now it is the president of the African Union.
Well, let's turn the discussion now to this international dimension. And certainly, both Ali and Awol, you've brought up the African Union. But David Shinn, if I could turn to you, one thing we have been hearing from protesters who have contacted Al Jazeera throughout the day is they're looking for the international community to intervene. They're looking for international actors to step in and help them. My first question, I guess, is who are the international community that they are reaching out to? Because we have heard from other international actors, the Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, who have been intervening, one could argue, by their having dialogue with the military councils. So, David Shinn, would you say there is an international community that would be prepared to help and intervene?
The international community is not united on a position towards what is happening in Sudan. I think the three critical players today are Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Egypt, because of its long-standing interests in Sudan, the fact that it is currently chair of the African Union, is in a position to play a key role in the African Union. The Emiratis and the Saudis, because of their financial support for the Transitional Military Council. These are the three countries that have the greatest prospect for influencing, either for better or worse, what happens there. I'm also a little bit surprised that the African regional players are not more engaged in what is happening in Sudan. This would be a time for Ethiopia to step up and put more pressure on the Transitional Military Council in Khartoum in an effort to try to influence them in a more reasonable direction. If you look further beyond the Gulf states and the African states and the African Union, I don't really see that much taking place by the Europeans or the Americans. They're wringing their hands, they're issuing statements condemning violence. I don't see them stepping in any meaningful way. Possibly you could resume some sanctions on Sudan, but that will not have any immediate impact upon the situation.
And why, David
and the
Shinn,
Europeans and the Americans...
Why are they not prepared to intervene?
I think it's just in the nature of the European and the American government not to engage in any kind of a military way other than issuing statements and possibly increasing sanctions. They're not willing to go beyond that. That's what's going on in Europe and the United States today.
Okay, Aly Verjee, do you think there is a greater role for African states such as Ethiopia, for example, to intervene?
Oh, absolutely, there's a greater role. Let me first agree with Awol that I wasn't suggesting that the June 30th African Union deadline was what was going to drive the behavior of the Transitional Military Council in terms of what that deadline meant. What I was suggesting was that in terms of the timing of this violence, that it happens now at the beginning of June rather than the end of June because of that deadline. It would look very bad for the Transitional Council, even if they were going to ignore the African Union deadline.
Well, it doesn't look great now. I mean, regardless of when it
doesn't
comes.
look great now, but it looks even worse. It looks even worse in 3 weeks' time or 4 weeks' time. I think Ethiopia and the rest of the regional countries, it's unlikely they're going to get involved. I mean, Ethiopia is consumed with its own internal realities. It's not going to really demonstrate any meaningful restraint over Khartoum, unfortunately. So it does come back to, as has been mentioned, Egypt and Saudi and the Emirates in particular. But I think there is a role for other Gulf countries as well, including Qatar. And there is still, I think, a role for the Americans and the Europeans, because clearly the messages of restraint that have been asked for by ambassadors and embassies and senior officials, that hasn't been enough. You know, diplomacy by tweet is not going to cause the military council to demonstrate restraint, but there are further actions that can be taken that would show, at least, even if they're not going to change the total trajectory of what's happening, they would show at least that there is a consequence, there is a serious outcome that comes when you kill people for no good reason whatsoever.
Awol, do you think that there is a greater role other than tweets? Because as we know, it's easy to issue statements, it's easy to tweet out your 140 characters of condemnation, but if there's nothing backing that up, what essentially is the point? So in terms of a greater role from the US or Europe, what do you think that might constitute?
I think you raised a very important question, which is whether there is an international community today, and if there is, what that looks like. And in my view, there's not really a body that that count as an international community as such, a community that kind of defends certain ideas, certain values, instead of simply acting based on specific national interests or on the basis of kind of transactional considerations. So from that point of view, I think the cries of the Sudanese for voice and hearing on the part of the international community, not to do much, but to simply uphold the key kind of central instruments that brought this community together and created various international organizations. That is not a lot to ask, but in practical terms, I think it is very difficult for Sudanese at this stage to expect anything from the U.S. administration, which is significantly retreating from multilateralism and not taking issues of human rights and democracy seriously at all. And the Europeans also intervene in African states or in global south more generally when they have a very particular kind of interest. If they don't have strong geopolitical interest, they are usually reluctant. I think regional countries, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and Egyptians have a very particular interest. They are influential, as Ambassador Shinn said, but they are very clearly on the side of the military. Okay. Ethiopia, as Ali said, has its own issues. It is going through a period of very difficult transition, and I think it will not have the means and the resources to go beyond its own problems and somewhat try to address the Sudanese issue.
OK, gentlemen, we're in the dying minutes of this debate, unfortunately. Just quickly, what does the future hold? Is this now over, now game over for the protesters? If I could ask you to be very brief in your answers, starting with David Shinn.
Yeah, I must say I am less optimistic now than I have been since this began in early April. Up until now, I've been quite optimistic. We've had a couple of these incidents before, and both sides have weathered the problem, but this has gotten far more serious, and I'm very concerned. OK, Aly Verjee?
The protesters have been resilient. They've mobilized repeatedly. They've shown they have staying power. What they haven't been able to do is overcome the intransigence of the military, even though they've had some successes, and that's going to continue to be the issue. But I think they're still going to be able to mobilize quite significantly. OK, and Awol Allo, the final thought to you. Is this the end of the uprising? What does the future hold for the protesters?
I don't think so. I think there is still room for compromise. I think they can still go back and tinker with those initial arguments that they have sketched out. I think there are rooms still to agree, not necessarily on the composition of the Sovereign Council, but also on the other institutions. There is a way in which they can go back and distribute power more evenly. I think that is a much better position. If the opposition has to compromise, and if this transition means going incrementally, I think that's a much better position than the situation we have now, or the possible escalation of the current situation.
But who would the protesters sit down and talk with? Is there a willingness from the military to talk, Awol?
So the military council is still, at least rhetorically, it is open to discussions. The parties are very well known. On the one hand, you have the military council. On the other hand, you have the forces for freedom and change. They can still go back and negotiate and agree on a deal. And I think there are things that the military council has to compromise and also things that the opposition group can live with.
OK, and we'll have to wait and see if either side will be prepared to compromise. But for now, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much for this debate. Thank you to David Shinn, Awol Allo, and Aly Verjee. I'd like to thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And the conversation continues online. Take part by heading to our Facebook page. That's /AJ Inside Story. Or you can head to Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. And I'm @Halla Mohieddeen. From me and the whole team here, bye for now.